Morning, everyone. My name is Susan Zell, and I am lucky enough to be one of the hosts for tonight's presentation. It's called Opening a Can of Worms, a Threat to Consider. Our presenter is Sherry Kern, who's a Virginia Beach Master Gardener. We will explore the characteristics of invasive earthworms, such as the European earthworm and the Asian jumping earthworm. We're going to determine what makes them invasive and how they are disrupting our native forest and affecting biodiversity. We will delve into the ecology of our native earthworms and take a peek at the new invasive hammerhead worm. The presentation will be 50 minutes in length with 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please mute your speaker and take yourself off video to prevent any distractions. The chat box will be open for questions for Sherry, and Candy, one of our co-hosts, will collate the questions for her to answer. If you have ideas to share with other participants, please save those for another format. Before you leave the presentation, please complete a very short poll. You'll find that poll just to the right of the chat box at the bottom of your screen. The poll will open as we open the forum for questions from the chat box. Again, our presenter tonight is Sherry Kern. Sherry is a Virginia Beach Master Gardener, class of 1998. She's been a tree steward since the early 2000s. She's a certified arborist through the International Society of Arboriculture. She was a horticulture instructor at TCC in Chesapeake for almost 20 years. She's a co-author of Best Plants for Hampton Roads, a landscape and garden companion. She is a self-proclaimed tree lover and hugger, and she is a frequent guest speaker in the community, sharing her knowledge and love of all things gardening. Sherry, welcome, and look forward to your presentation.
Are you ready for me to share?
Yes.
I could just pop. Does that work? No, because I didn't share. Okay, I think we're all set now. People, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, I'm assuming yes. Okay, people have the funny reactions when I tell them I do a talk on worms, and they burst out laughing and said, who would attend that? I said, well, you'll be surprised. Anyway, I hope I make your time worthwhile on this kind of rainy, stormy, nice evening, depending on what you're getting. Anyway, opening a can of worms, a threat to consider. Somewhere I read where someone called it global worming. Ha ha ha. I think that's funny. Anyway, a lot of people consider worms the best thing since the plow because of all the things that worms do. They get their red wigglers because their frass is full of nutrients and they aerate the soil, decompose organic matter. They're good for farms and gardens. And one thing I do want to mention is that with farms and gardens, those soils are already so disturbed that we're really not going to talk about those. We're going to talk more about those soils that aren't as disturbed, such as our wild forests and our local forests, if you will. Worms have been called a bunch of things, and ecosystem engineers, environmental engineers, and many rototillers. So a lot of good names. But then Peter Grothman, you could see here at the bottom of the page, the earthworms are in the soil because the soil is healthy. They are not necessarily doing anything for it. So it's a whole different spin on looking at earthworms. Our native earthworms, we don't have many. We have about 21 species. And if I've seen any, I don't know it. Because the European introductions, the nice red earthworm that we see in the gardens or out in when we're weeding and all that, that is an invasive European earthworm. So our native ones tend to be smaller. They tend to be shy. They get totally outcompeted by the European and now Asian introductions. But you might find a native earthworm on a rotting log or in aquatic situations along the edges, things like that. It may be out in the mountains more so than here. So I'm really not going to talk about natives at all. I couldn't find much online about them. Okay, there are three ecological groups of earthworms, and we're not delving very deeply in any of them, but just enough so that you have an idea of what you might be looking at. And the ecological groups are the functional groups, three functional groups. And the first one we're going to talk about is the epigeic functional group, which has your red wigglers. And these are the people who are interested in vermicomposting. You want your red wigglers. Well, they tend to stay pretty much on top of the soil, and they eat the leaf litter. Essentially, they chum the soil and organic matter into nutrient-rich frass, which people really like. They tend to be smaller than the other ones, but I don't know. You put a red wiggler up by a European earthworm. Red wigglers are also European, but you put them up by them, and I don't see a whole lot of difference. Okay, the next group is the endogeic, and this group has the European redworms and the jumping worms, the Asian jumping worms, which is the group that I really want to focus on later on. But these are soil dwellers, and what they do is they pull organic matter and beneficial fungi down into the earth with them. But they're fairly shallow. They're just in the topsoil, so you won't see them very deep at all. Then the third group are the ansic group. These go deep, and these are big. Your European night crawlers. They're big. They have big burrows, and in those burrows, they can stay there for several years. So they really do aerate the soil. Essentially, these guys mostly eat dirt and everything in the dirt. Okay, red wigglers. I'm just going to mention this just for a moment, just because people are more familiar with maybe these due to vermicomposting. And right here, that is the clitellum, and that's what you want to look at when you're trying to identify worms. I mean, you could get a lot more technical, and there are sites online that will give you more technical information. But essentially, the purpose for the clitellum is for sexual reproduction, and it's where cocoons are formed. And the cocoons are the little egg sacs, if you will, that the earthworms then eject or emit and leave those little worms. Anyway, I'm going to see if I can pronounce it. Eisenia fetida. Eisenia fetida. The reason why I'm given the botanical or scientific names is if you want to research anything any further, use the scientific name to help your research. There are other species out there that are called red wigglers too. Next is the Lumbricus rubellus, which is the European redworm. And you could see right here, the clitellum is quite prominent. It tends to be raised a little bit compared to the rest of the body. And what you're seeing in this picture to the right are the frass that they leave. This is what they poop out, if you will. And this is in more sandy soil and in a warm turfgrass setting. So when you see this, you know, okay, it is your earthworm at bay, working. There are some insects that will also cause some of these things, but look for earthworms first if you want to make sure what's happening. Okay, then the night crawler is the Lumbricus terrestris. Here is its clitellum. See how it's also segmented, and it is raised a little bit compared to the rest of the body. Whereas the jumping worm, which is, now let me see if I can say jumping worm, which is the Amethys agrestis. egregious. Anyway, I have trouble with pronouncing these, but here is the jumping worm, and the clitellum here is smooth, and it goes all the way around. And it tends to be a whitish, grayish color. Incidentally, these jumping worms have lots of common names. Some people call them crazy worms, some call them snake worms, wood eels, Alabama snake worms. I mean, I've heard different names for them. So it's pretty interesting. Then this is a handout, if you will, from the New York Master Naturalists, which discuss this because jumping worms are very prevalent in the northern US, from the Midwest over to the Northeast. And you'll see why in just a moment. But do you see that clitellum right there? Tends to be a whitish, milkish color, and it goes completely around. This picture is pretty interesting. Notice University of Wisconsin, and it shows two different species of jumping worms. And the one on the left, they are thinking might not be fully mature, even though it's so big, because its clitellum hasn't turned white yet, or gray color. This one right here is mature. See how its clitellum has turned that whitish color. So when you are looking for these worms, look at that clitellum. Also, with the Asian jumping worms, their behavior is a good way to determine what's going on with them. The problem with these Asian jumping worms, they alter the soil chemistry, structure, and the function. They impact everything living in that soil, vertebra, non-vertebra, and your microorganisms. And they overwinter primarily in the cocoon stage. This next, okay, I want to thank Michelle Booker, who is a Virginia Beach master gardener. She let me go with her to a site here in Virginia Beach where there were a lot of jumping worms. So I'm going to show you a video. So if you're squeamish, you might want to look away.
See, that's a baby right there. They're very bluish green, kind of.
Do you see the behavior of the jumping worms? See how they writhe, snake-like. Your European earthworms might move a little bit, but they don't writhe like that. I have actually found two of them in my own yard. And I am not a vermicomposter or anything. I'm not a fisherman or anything. And one of them had been flushed out by rains. And I picked it up about a year ago, and it did that really wiggly stuff. It writhes all over, thrashes around, and it fell off my hand. But of course, it startled me. And then I found one just recently weeding. And when I pulled a weed up came a jumping worm with it. It's like, oh my goodness, I don't like the idea of them getting established. So I will kill these worms. And I recommend you do too. Okay, this is another picture of these. And you can see how it's kind of whitish. Difficult to see the clitellum. But on this picture over here, I need to reduce that. Okay, and this picture right here, right there is a cocoon. And typically you're not going to see them at all. They're tiny little things. And they're the size, I don't know if you could see me or not, but they're the size of the back of an earring. And what I'm holding in my fingers is the back of an earring, which is how tiny they are. And they're going to be covered in dirt, so you're not going to notice them. And this is where the danger is. It's called middens, which is also another word for the frass. I'm just going to use the word frass. I think people are more comfortable with that. This shows how the European redworm leaves the property. See how you've got bunches of organic material that they haven't fully eaten or anything. And the last thing they will eat are your oak leaves. See how the oak leaves haven't been touched much? And that's because of the tannic acid. They don't like that. The picture here shows the jumping worms frass. And some people liken it to used coffee grounds. And I've also heard it discussed as being like cooked hamburger. So it's just up to you what you want to call it. If you see this kind of frass, you start looking around, find where the edge is, and it's along that edge where you might be more apt to find the worms. Okay, this picture on the left, this is by Dr. Susan Day. And right here, this disturbed part, this has been invaded by the jumping worms. And this area right here on the right has not been invaded yet. And there is a distinct line down through there. You could see that distinction. And so if you can keep them from moving any further, that's good. A fellow master gardener here in Virginia Beach, Vanessa Miller, allowed me to share this particular picture of hers. Her property backs up to some water, and she is having major issues with jumping worms in her landscape and even in her raised beds. But what really got her to noticing that she might have jumping worms was she started seeing like these coffee grounds on the ground. And you could see how distinctive they are from the dirt nearby. There's a big difference there. So this is the frass of jumping worms. Well, she and I were talking about how they got into her raised beds, and she was thinking maybe it came in her compost. Well, then I asked her, were there fishermen at the water? She said, yes. I said, well, have you seen them dumping their bait? Yes, she had. And we think maybe they've been using jumping worms as bait, and what they have left, they just dump them on the ground, where jumping worms are going to go where they can find nice places to eat. They want the restaurant that's open 24/7. So yes, jumping worms are sold at bait shops, and because they wiggle around so much on the fishing hook that the fish are attracted. Fishermen like them. Another lady whose name is Vanessa, also in my garden club, had transferred here from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And she said in her garden club there, you know, when you start digging up plants and dividing them to sell at your plant sale, they don't wash the roots once or twice, they wash them 3 times. That's to ensure all dirt is off and all possibility of any of the cocoons have been washed away, so that they're not selling jumping worm cocoons with the plant. And that is a concern. As a matter of fact, I'm becoming myself more picky about what I buy because of this situation. This is literally a can of worms. And I want to thank this gentleman, Stuart Terrabor, who is a relative of Gretchen Fisher, who is a fellow Virginia Beach master gardener. And he gave me permission to use this picture. This is in his upstate New York garden. And one day, that's all the worms that he got out of his own garden. And you can just look at that. And the majority of them are jumping worms. They just reproduce like crazy. They're just terrible things. And so anyway, it gives you an idea that you can reach in your soil and pull up handfuls of these worms. Okay, now, if you look, you know, in the Pleistocene epoch, we had these gigantic ice sheets, and this huge ice sheet right here, you could see how far south they felt that it came. Well, everywhere where the glaciers were, there are no native earthworms. So if you're wondering, well, what about Virginia? You see how we are right here. Well, you know, maybe the glaciers came further. I don't know. We do have a few natives, but nothing to speak of like these invasive species are. So these states that are here that have not had earthworms since the last ice sheet, and their forests have developed without earthworms. Well, the earthworms are just wreaking havoc on their landscapes, really causing a big issue. So how did the European and Asian worms get here? We're actually in the second wave of worms coming in, but the first wave, if you will, were brought by settlers, primarily the first European settlers, and they brought their worms with them because in Europe, the earthworms are a good thing and they're native. They churn that soil up and they do all the good stuff. Well, they wanted to make sure they had the good stuff here too. So they brought the worms with them, and the climate habitats between Europe and North America, very similar. So the worms just, hey, I'm home. This is good. Came in on ballast, the horticultural trade, agricultural, fishing industry, and they get into our forests this way. The logging equipment, because it gets into the cocoons get into the tread, backcountry fishing, off-road recreation. We're moving these things all over the place. So if we look at a healthy forest, healthy forests are diverse and stable. You're not seeing a lot of massive changes. Now, this particular picture, if it looks too clean to be a native forest per se, and that's because the road crews pick up the fallen branches and stuff like that. But anyway, you have this balance between the structure of the soil and its chemistry. The pH 4 is acidic, 6 is moderately to mildly acidic. Also, they have the stable form of ammonium, of a nitrogen, which is ammonium, NH4 plus. And notice the plus, the positive. Our soils around here tend to have a lot of clay in them. Clay is negative, and this positive ion is attracted to the negative. So ammonium doesn't move around much in the soil. It pretty much finds a spot to cling and stays there. And then the nitrogen gets locked up in vegetation and gets released gradually. So another reason why this is a diverse, stable ecosystem. It's well aerated by the roots. So what do you need worms? You don't need worms for that. You have a duff layer, which is what you're seeing here. That's the leaves. And it's the bacteria and fungi that you depend upon for decomposition of organic matter. You don't need earthworms for that. The duff layer, a little bit more information about the duff layer. Not only does it hold moisture, it acts as mulch, site of most nutrient exchange networks between the fungal mycelium and the roots, which is very important in other functions also. It's a microclimate where many seeds germinate, and it's a habitat for a lot of ground-dwelling birds, mammals, invertebrates, vertebrates, and woodland salamanders. So you have so much going on there. The mulch acts as a blanket in the wintertime. It acts as mulch. Not talking about a mulch you might take in. By all means, do not take in mulch into the forest. It doesn't need it. It gets it from the leaves that are dropped from the trees. Forest ecology, this is just a slide showing right here in the light infestation of the earthworms. You will still see your vegetative layer, you'll still see that litter and duff, and you'll see your horizons. Well, if it's heavily infested, see how they've eaten up all the vegetative part and the duff part. And now they're going into this one, and you're starting to see them moving down somewhat in this. So, and this is talking primarily about your jumping worms. One thing I want you to notice, Great Lakes Worm Watch. This is a group that keeps track of the worms, where they're coming in, where they're seeing new invasions. They pretty much monitor. There's not a whole lot they could do for eradication. Okay, now this is going to show you That is the sugar maple forest before the invasion, and that's after. You see how you're starting to see a decrease. Now that doesn't mean that the earthworms have invaded and moved on. They're still there, and they're still munching away and destroying anything on that earth floor. Eventually you get down to soil, as you see over here in this picture. You just get down to bare soil, which is not a good thing. Okay, this is an interesting thing. Earthworms do not like acidic soils. Well, around here, we have acidic soils. Typically, where it rains and everything, you tend to have more acidic soils. But they have calciferous glands. And in this picture at the bottom, right there it is, it's a calciferous gland. And what those glands do is they can neutralize acidic organic matter, essentially with calcium carbonate. Okay, calcium carbonate is what you add to the soil to raise the pH or to make it towards more alkalinic situation. But then they turn around and they change the stable ammonium to nitrate, which is NO3 minus. It's a negative charge and clay's negative, so it doesn't clean. So guess what? It leaches out and causes problems in other ways. So these are earthworms. You can see now why they are a problem in our forests. How do they impact the forest? University of Vermont gives you a lot of good information. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but I am going to point out some things. Right here, the castings do not absorb moisture. Again, we're referring to the jumping worms. The jumping worms. They change decay organisms. They reduce your fungi populations, especially your mycorrhizal fungi population and your saprophytic fungi. Okay, you lose carbon and they send it into the air, which yes, now you're adding to the greenhouse effect. And what they have found specifically in Pennsylvania, where more research has been done, is they actually threaten the stability of the maple and beech ecosystem. One thing they've also found is there's a major effect on insect fauna above ground. There's not as many insects above ground, and it's due maybe to their larvae underground, such as beetle and fly larvae. Maybe they're being eaten, and because these jumping worms eat everything. If it's organic, they will eat it. And they cause changes in the vegetation. But what they found was populations of predatory insect species and spiders are actually increasing. So obviously more research needs to be done about why is that the case. More information about the what's happening above ground here, losing your spring ephemerals, such as, okay, hold on, I've changed my notes, such as things like trilliums, trout lilies, Virginia bluebells, other words, those spring ephemerals that like acidic soils. So you're losing the diversity in your food chain. You could see how it's affecting pollinators, fewer insectivores, especially birds, because the adult birds feed on these larvae and excuse me, things above ground. Yes, birds will feed on the earthworms too. And it's increasing the leaching of nitrogen, because now the nitrogen is that nitrate form, which leaches out. So anyway, conducive to invasive plant species. We'll talk about privet in just a minute. Okay, this is just another picture giving you some more, another pictorial image. Here it is without earthworms, and here it is with earthworms. Are you seeing the difference? And this is not like 10 years afterwards. Okay, I would love to see what it looks like after that, but maybe I wouldn't either. But it's pretty graphic, I think. Ironically, with the white-tailed deer densities going up, they're losing what they do in their grazing. They're exposing the decomposing leaves. And so you're losing your forest floor, which is changing the plant communities. But here, this is the ironical thing, consumption. Oh, this is changing this following earthworm invasion. Okay, that's what happens. And so, but the earthworm, these deer come in and they eat anything that's sprouting. But actually, earthworms love deer pellets. It's like, oh no, so it's a catch-22 here. If you like deer, you're going to feed the earthworms. Okay, so privet. And I'm looking primarily here at Chinese privet, which is Ligustrum sinensis. This is a horrible, wicked vine or plant. It is very invasive. And what they found was in studies is that underneath these privet, there were large populations of these earthworms. And if you're wondering why, it's because the pH is higher not under the earthworms, under the shrubs. The pH is higher. So it's going towards the alkalinic side. And these European and the Asian love this kind of situation. So it gives the competitive advantage to European earthworms. Well, what you could do is remove these privet, and I know like at the Arboretum in Chesapeake, they really are starting to try to get rid of this privet that has totally invaded that Arboretum. But it's leading to a pH decrease, which is not conducive to earthworms. So then the earthworms start dying out. So we're seeing good news, bad news. If you have them, bad news. Once you take them out, you're starting to get good news. Conditions conducive to invasive earthworms. Somebody's thrown some out on the grounds, and they marched up from the bank of the lake, and they're marching up. So if you have the nitrate form of nitrogen, then yeah, it's conducive. High organic matter, because they feed on that. They feed on soils rich in calcium, because what calcium does is it helps buffer the acidic part, which makes the soil more alkalinic. They prefer the trees found in young forests, such as your basswood, sugar maple, red maple, white ash, tulip poplar, and sweet gum. So they like those. And they like the seeds of a couple of other species, pond pine and the sugar maple. So anyway, it's interesting how they're starting to see some interactions here in their studies. There's not a whole lot of scientific information available on these earthworms, and that's a conundrum. More people are starting to study earthworms, though. Okay, calcium. We already know, okay, when calcium in the soil is diminished, okay, when you start getting more acidic soils, it reduces songbird populations. And it's because acidic soils restrict availability of calcium-rich food, such as slugs. And birds love slugs. It's needed for bird reproduction, calcium for their eggshells. Litter calcium positively related to earthworm growth. So you could see that. You could see right here, calcium, remember it said 4 to 6 for a natural forest. So 4 to 6 is right in this range, right in here. So whoops, right here, calcium. Of course, the lower you get, the less available calcium is. Okay. They've also done research on birds, and this is just a budding research bit. And they're finding out that birds like hermit thrush and ovenbird, which are birds that like to nest, to build their nests on the ground with all that vegetation that's down there and the duff. Well, the invasion of these species, worms, is reducing that duff, and it's leading to a decline in populations of these particular birds. So let's see. Ovenbird nesting success declined in relation to declining forest floor thickness. Some other birds that are being affected, their populations, black and white warblers, Canada warbler, and ruffed grouse. Seed predation. This is a catch-22. It's good news / bad news. Okay, earthworms eat the smaller seeds that they find in the soil and on the soil, and their ingestion may actually kill the seeds. They don't know for sure. Or do the seeds go through and come out intact? Don't know. But what's interesting is, if you wonder why I have a picture of garlic mustard is a horrific invasive weedy species, and you will see it along woodland edges, and earthworms will eat garlic mustard seeds. They love garlic mustard, excuse me, as far as that goes. But ironically, the scientists think that this may increase the seed bank, which is just backwards of what you think. So, but I thought earthworms were good for plants. And I'll give you a moment to read that. It's affecting our natives because they don't have that duff that's needed to root, germinate, and root. And this part is scary. The rate and intensity of disturbance with that advancing leading edge. And you saw that slide that kind of gave us an idea of what that might look like. It says may eliminate the standing populations of most understory species, which is scary, you know, and a lot of those understory species are native, but some of them aren't. And again, notice that came out of the Great Lakes Worm Watch. That is an excellent site to get a lot of information, and research is trickling down from there down our way. Okay, there's a way to see, if you want to see if you have invasive worms on your property, you can do this. Incidentally, this will also bring up anything else, a lot of things. And it's the mustard pour. And Vanessa Miller, remember I showed you her slide of the coffee grounds, letting her know that she had the jumping worm. She used the mustard pour and a gallon of water with a 1/3 cup of ground mustard seed, and pour slowly into the ground because you want it to actually go in. You don't want to create a big splash, and you want it to go in, and you wait a few minutes for it to go in, and then you wait. And these worms do not like it. Well, neither do the European species. Doesn't matter. It will let you know what you're getting, and they will start coming up. And then you can look at those populations and see, do you have the European earthworm or do you have the jumping worm? So that will help give you an idea. We used to use soapy water, but you know, soap affects other vertebrae, invertebrate, and whereas the mustard pour doesn't. After about a half hour, it pretty much dissipates and it doesn't linger in the soil. Okay, so what can you do to prevent the spread of invasive earthworms, especially jumping worms? This is like a bumper sticker that Wisconsin has put out that shows what to do. Dispose of bait worms in the trash. So they're really targeting the fishermen here. So knowledge. One of the ways is knowledge. New York State has totally banned the sale and distribution of jumping worms. So you cannot buy those as bait in New York. Well, one of the recommendations is wormless composting, and I don't think that'll go over real well with many of you. Just don't use these invasive species for bait. There are other things you could use. I'm not a fisherman, so I don't know, but I know there are other things you can use. Inspect the soil. I told you about what that garden club does, is they wash off any of their garden soil, and then they use store-bought mix. Preserve your old forests. Don't plant any non-native trees or shrubs near the edges, because non-natives actually attract these. They tend to raise the pH, that type thing. And of course, there could be regulatory policy changes. One of the things that research has gone one direction is these wildfires out west and everything, is what effect do they have on these invasive worms? And what they have found is that prescribed fire, not the wildfires, but prescribed fire does kill cocoons. That's good news. That is good news. Obviously, more research. And of course, humans are the biggest mover of these things. Is, don't dump your bait, clean your tires before you start driving with any vehicle into woodlands. Don't spread mulch along walking trails, because that mulch is an organic matter, and it's a main reason for invading earthworms. And don't move them around yourself. Don't pick them up and take them. Oh, well, this worm, we need to put some over there. Don't do that with your red wigglers. Don't put them by the edge of the woods or anything like that. Keep them in your veggie garden or your agricultural fields, or share them with other people for their gardens. There are some physical removal methods that you can use. One is you can hand pick them, like the gentleman did in that bucket of worms. No chemicals. There aren't any recommended chemicals for use on these, because anything you use, you're going to kill other things too. However, you could kill them if you just have a couple, put them in a container with vinegar or rubbing alcohol. Or what you could do is put them in a bag, plastic bag, seal it up, put them out to bake in the full sun, and let the sun bake them. I don't recommend that you eat these things. Don't recommend you do that at all. But anyway, put them out there to bake. So that's solarization. At Cornell then added this. They said, put them in a bucket of alfalfa pellets. And what that does is that dries them out. These worms do not like it dry and hot. They like it moist and cooler. And I'm showing you, this is what your garden should look like, healthy, vigorous, that type thing. Hotter and drier soils limit earthworm populations. Well, there are a lot of critters that do eat earthworms. And you could see there's a long list. So there is I don't have it in this list. Oh, it's in another one. Okay. It's another slide. I've got too many slides on my pages here. But anyway, centipedes. If you're wondering about centipedes, but not all of them. So there's some they'll eat and some they won't. And what you want to do is to encourage the food web, to keep that out there. And if you see these digging in the soil, okay, and with rove beetles, not all of those will eat, or ground beetles, not all of those will eat them either. Good predictors for this is unfortunately good predictors for earthworm invasions in forests. My house backs up to a small plot of woods, just a very small plot. And this is what it looked like a few years ago. And it still looks like this. As far as I know, there's no real earthworm invasion there, but it is a young forest. It used to be a farmer's field. So it is a young forest. I don't know what the pH is like there, but because I haven't tested it, but I would say, I don't know what it is at all. But if you have calcium rich soils, which means, you don't have a lot of clay or anything, calcium rich soils. Remember, earthworms like that, they will create their own. Also, young forest, Old growth forests have primarily oaks, beeches, and hickories. And if you have that, then you have primarily an old growth forest, and you're not as apt to see earthworm invasions in that. So what happens, this is kind of a rerun. What happens to the forest after the earthworm invasion? They've cleared off all of the vegetation. Now you have bare soil, it gets compacted. And when you have compacted soils, then you don't have good water movement or anything like that. They threaten regeneration of your tree and shrub species. They reduce vigor in the seedlings. They change the light levels because you don't have as many plants underground. The number of insects will decrease, as what I had just mentioned earlier. They change soil conditions. So there's just a lot that goes on with these. Notice I'm focusing primarily on forests, and that's because those soils haven't been disrupted as much as your garden soils have. So is it all doom and gloom? Well, kind of. You need more and more research. And as a matter of fact, there is a group of people that did research to figure out how to research the earthworms, because they don't know how to study their movement or anything like that. All they've been doing primarily is keeping an eye on them, just moderating them, if you will. So they need more research to monitor and manage them. They need more, especially about heat tolerances, changes in soil, effects on biodiversity, because right now there's no way they know how to predict potential for invasion. It's just difficult to do that. Improve logging practices by cleaning your tires, cleaning the equipment so that you're not moving worms from an infested area to a non-infested area. Reduce your deer herds so that they don't put the pellets there that the worms love. And also maybe try to reduce your populations of invasive weed species, such as that garlic mustard that I mentioned before. And this is just showing some of the ways that you can do that. Okay, now this is almost my last slide. This is the invasive hammerhead worm. There are several of them in this genus, the Bipalium, and it has been seen here in Virginia. I have never seen one, and I know if I do see one, I'm going to scream and run because I'm going to think I've seen a snake. These are flatworms. They come from Southeast Asia, and they're called hammerhead because their head, this end is reminiscent of the hammerhead shark. So, but they've been here in the US for more than 100 years. They figure that they came in soil, in plant material. They came that way. Now, these will feed on everything. They feed on earthworms and other organisms in the soil. They'll feed on each other, which is kind of interesting. They're generalist feeders, predators. They'll eat sow bugs, spiders, insects, snails, slugs, and all this other. They do have, now here I'm getting conflicting information. They do have some neurotoxin in their skin, which is the tetrodotoxin, which is found in pufferfish. So it's very dangerous. So if you were to handle one of these, be sure you have gloves on, or excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. Excuse me. So anyway, these worms, North Carolina has a lot of information there. They've done, their state entomologist is Dr. Matt Burton, Bertone. He's done a lot of research with it. So that's where I found the bulk of my information.
Sherry, you got 10 minutes.
Okay, good. I'm almost finished. They reproduce both asexually by fragmentation, just like all the other earthworms will do, and by sexual means. And they require a moist habitat, just like your other worms do. Don't eat these worms. Do not eat them, because they do carry, a lot of them will carry rat lungworms, and that could cause some major issues with your health. So don't know much about these worms at all. If any of you see any, I would love to know, and maybe you can save it for me. Here is this slide. I had to put this on there by Dean Koontz, who is a New York Times best-selling author. He's a bad case of arrested development, more screwed up, twisted up, tangled up than a couple of earthworms making babies. To me, that just made me laugh out loud. And then I have lots of research here, a lot of sources that I have used. And I didn't even scratch the surface, pardon the pun. So, Candy, I'm ready if you want to ask some questions.
Yes, ma'am. Could you tell us more about wormless composting? Should I destroy the worms that occur naturally in compost?
Oh, well, check and see what they are. What are they? If they're the invasive jumping worm, kill them. Okay, that's because the danger that they pose is just too great. But if they're your other earthworms, it's your personal opinion about that.
You know what? That's all the questions I have. So if other folks have questions, please put them in the chat section. What is a sure way to tell if they're invasive?
I'm assuming they're referring to the jumping worm.
I think so.
What's a sure way to tell? You're going to see them after rains. They come out, and you will see them. And being gardeners, you're in your soil all the time anyway. You will see them there. You'll actually see them by the handsful.
Should we worry about red/European earthworms in our gardens? In our home?
Because they've been here since the 1600s. And there's no real problem, because remember, our garden and agricultural fields are already disturbed soils. So all they're doing is what you want them to do. They're helping aerate more and things like that. So no, there's really nothing to do.
Is Virginia Tech doing any research on jumping worms in Virginia?
That's a good question. I don't really know that answer. So maybe at Master Gardener College this summer, somebody could find out.
So are earthworms very helpful? Are they very useful in gardens? I assume they mean the non-invasive sort.
Yeah, well, even the European earthworm, the red wigglers, all those, they're considered invasive. But if you don't, like I don't do vermicomposting, and I don't need it. I don't think I need it, because I seem to have pretty good soils. They, where I've worked on building them up over the years. And also with backing up to woods, now I really don't want them.
Do the jumping worms
opinion.
Do the jumping worms look and move like snake worms?
Because the way they writhe, they look like, people think they're snakes. But when you look at it, once they calm down, you look at them, they look like earthworms. That's what they are. They are earthworms. They just have that whitish clitellum.
And that's all our questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much too.
Sherry, we really enjoyed the presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and please join us on August 1st for a presentation by Chris Epps on common pests and diseases in the vegetable garden. We'll leave